Good morning. I'm very happy to open this early morning panel entitled Imagining Converts and Conversion. Imagining Converts and Conversion. My name is Ben-Shalom. I'm from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And we have in this panel 2 lecturers and 1 respondent. And we're going to start with Peter Lehnardt, who is a senior lecturer of medieval literature in the Department of Hebrew Literature here at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. His research enlarges and details in 2 areas: the literature of the world of Jewish prayer, the artistic prose, and the liturgical poetry. He's working on 2 major projects, the one writing a book of literary history of Hebrew liturgical poetry around the use of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, under the working title Bound to be Unbound. The other showing the beginnings of autochthonous writing in Ashkenaz in the 11th and 12th century, in their dialogue with the surrounding literary culture. And his lecture today is Attempted Conversion to My Kind of New Mankind, restaging the conversations of Alexander the Great with the Indian sages in medieval literature.
Thank you very much for the initiators and organizers of this conference. It comes to after now 5 years, and the idea that to begin the project with the conference, so that we are now the 6th conference after 5 years. This is one of the interesting points. It all began, as usual, with my work in medieval philology, with a snippet of a few lines in a 14th century Hebrew manuscript from Italy. It looked like the final lines of the first part of a tractate strongly attributed to or written at the beginning of the 5th century by the Bishop of Aspona, Palladius of Helenopolis. Called, and now you can see there are Greek names and there are Latin names of the tractate. I refer to Palladius on the people of India and the Brahmans. As David Flusser already announced in 1956, while working on the interpolation based on the Roman Alexander in the book of Yosipon, these 9 lines attest a Hebrew-Jewish translation from the Middle Ages of a Christian tractate about the ascetic way of life of the Indians, especially that of their elites. So the first question was, what happened that an appendix of the Historia Lysiaca, a history of early Christian monasticism, written to promote ascetic monastic ideals for Christianity in late antiquity, could find a Jewish reader, and even more a Jewish translator into Hebrew? The second question is how this text became part of the Greek meta, the collection of historic and popular traditions, but most important, secular matter about Alexander the Great. Working now almost 10 years, some weeks every year, on the more than 5 Hebrew translations of the Roman of Alexander and their place in Hebrew literature in their relation to the literatures of the surrounding majority cultures, it became quite clear that in this area too, until a few years ago, Hebraica non liguntur. But it is only fair to mention a change in direction marked by the conference volume edited by Marcus Stock, Alexander the Great in the Middle Ages, Transcultural Perspectives, Toronto, 2016. But what did not change until now, almost nobody uses the research into the Hebrew versions for the hermeneutics of one of the most prominent multilingual book events ongoing from antiquity to early modern, the Roman of Alexander. Thus my paper today shall deal, based on pagan, Jewish, Christian sources alike, with one of the 3 major novellae in the 3rd book of the Roman of Alexander, that elaborate the experience of the limitations of power and wisdom, and that put the focus on the turning points for the undefeated conqueror from the east back to Babylonia and his early death. To demonstrate this interpretation, Let us listen for a moment to the 9th century chronicon of Georgios Hamatolos, the monk, and have a look at it. So, Alexander drew up his army against Darius at Issopolis in Cilicia. He defended them, slaughtered many of his armies, captured the entire kingdom, including the land of the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, and the Babylonians. These are 5 books in Aryan, yes, just in one sentence. In Arianos. And in addition, all the parts of India and its kingdoms, except for the kingdom of Kandaki, and the widowed ruler of Inner India, who took him prisoner in the following way. I jumped a little bit. For he said it would be shameful and unusual and even ridiculous for a man who had defeated men with his bravery to be conquered by women. He reached to the furthest part of India, the great ocean which encircles the world, and in this the great island of the Brahmans. He discovered their wonderful, even superhuman way of life, their reverence and worship of the God of all things, by which he was very impressed. Admired the heights of their philosophy, which these men, the philosophy that these men had reached. Okay. The Amazons have no husbands, but the story of Kandaki, and that concerning the Amazons alike, we have to leave for a future paper about the 1st and 2nd sex in the Roman of Alexander. What? No, just my paper. It's okay. No, something happened. But this is not the... אז אני רואים את המסך הזה, לא רואים את המסך של המצגת. כי הוא מזהה. I tried. So the idea that Georgios the monk relates in his history, in his very shortcutted history of the late Greek period, to three events in the life of Alexander. It's the meeting with the Brahmans, it's Kandaki and the Amazons, and he takes the way where the dramatic period of Alexander, and he is not interested in any battles or something like this. Materials, he has no idea that there was a revolt in the army of Alexander or something like this. This is not interesting at all. But why have the Brahmans such a wonderful, such a good way of life? Was this Alexander that was impressed so much by the Brahmans, or was it far more Georgios when he looked at this way, when he looked at the way of life of the Brahmans? So, could it be that the original meeting was far more based on Alexander's attempt to conquer his stronghold, this stronghold of Indian cultural and religious identity, as any other he did before, and to convert the Brahmans or Gymnosophists to his worldview and his kind of new mankind? Or maybe we have to see the other way around. The story about the meeting had to explain to later generation why we are not living under Indian rule, and why Alexander did not succeed to conquer India. With these questions, we are entering the area of literary research and a possible inquiry about the restagings of the conversations of Alexander the Great with the Indian sages in late antiquity and medieval period. So now I have to turn to some points to the special materials that is called Roman Alexander, a short but necessary introduction. I may presume that everybody here in the room has a notion of Alexander the Great. He represents an historical phenomena well known and well studied. How we get our image of Alexander the Macedonian, this is already a completely other question. The reflection of his person and his alleged deeds are manifold, and one is to tend to say too manifold, because we are lacking beyond the initial fascination, like our predecessors in antiquity and the Middle Ages, any authoritative and authentic book of Alexander. So, just some remarks in the vast Alexander literature, and I shorten this very up. We have early Greek reflections of Alexander, of his lifetime. Then we have a gap of 200 years of literary text, and then we have Roman sources dealing with Alexander in a complete different cultural context. This is what I call the Garstiger Graben, the muddy moat of history, or the Chafira Machpir, that was the idea of Lessing, that we have some historical events, as important as they are unreachable for us in this term. So the historical Alexander is unreachable. We know this kind of question from other places in religious history. But this is not religious history. This is secular history and dealing with these things. So we have at the end of this period, a new period beginning again in late Roman period. In Egypt we have the beginning with the Roman of Alexander, a new kind of literary event. And I'm dealing mostly with my materials, because the early materials we have no reflections but in rabbinic literature, in Hebrew literature, the Roman Alexander, we have complete translations into Hebrew. So I'm dealing mainly with the Roman Alexander and its reflections. So, the Roman Alexander is the life script of a winner. If you want to be a winner, like in the conception of Eric Berne, you have to need a life script that is functioning and that will make you live with your life. And therefore, I would like to place here a contentional distinction to the reference to this kind of literature from antiquity. As the Roman of, not the Romance. The antique Roman of produces a life script, as termed by Eric Berne, communicable to new audiences, illustrated in dramatic narratives of a person's lifespan from before death, from before birth to after death. There is no other take. This is the life script. This makes the main difference between a roman of and a novella that dramatizes a key scene which characterizes a life script or a person. According to this distinction, Luke intended to write a life script of Jesus to reveal a new world order and not a Jesus romance, just to take this on Jesus novel. Yeah? On the important characteristics of the antique roman and what makes it transferable to new audiences is the focus on personal relations and not on bruta facta. And it is more sentimental as an historical source should be. Antique Roman and high late Middle Ages romans have in common that there are composite texts made of episodes on life-changing or world order-challenging events, the novella. This kind of quite independent literary subunits were, like most of the mythologoi, part of a greater story, but at times also dismissible or transferable. And this makes it so interesting to deal with this kind of text. The Roman Alexander has all of this. A challenging life script, a lot of elaborations on interpersonal relations, and as a true opera aperta, the term of Umberto Eco, a revolving door in and out of all kinds of novella. Thus, middle-class literature from late antiquity could become a literary must at any medieval court in the world. Spread from Iceland to Malaysia, in a dozen of versions in more than 20 languages. But finally, the historical critical approach of European humanism eliminated the Roman of Alexander from the canonization by the print. Only some late versions with national interest, like the Philata of the Romaeocene Greeks, were printed. So now, the novella about the meeting of the Indian sages. There's something very interesting, like yesterday in the sacred memoirs. If I'm speaking about a place where nobody can check what I'm telling about. And this is exactly the story with the Indian sages. But again, sacred memoirs are intended to be written into the home culture, not into the foreign culture. But nevertheless, the alleged meeting has a huge potential on exposing difference in cultures and the life scripts of the involved characters, similar to any traveler's report. In addition to, Alexander is a prototype of the world conqueror. So how do you conquer an alien life script, convert someone to your worldview, when killing means effectively to lose any option of imposing an episcript? Someone else won't change his life anymore after you killed him. So there is a technical problem of Alexander to conquer these Indians. And this gives one of the basic narrative structures. The Roman of Alexander uses these in his three parts of the story. Already in antiquity, it was divided into three major parts: the rising, the acts, and the obitus, the decline of Alexander from this world. We have so many versions. We have more than 5 Greek versions. We have 2 independent Latin translations. We have 2 independent Armenian translations. We have a Syriac, Arabic, Ethiopian, Persian, and you see it in red, at least 5 different Hebrew attempts to translate different versions of the Roman Alexander. This all makes it very interesting because everybody translate in the text found before him into his culture. Okay, so the texts are now in all cultures, in all religions. Alexander eats no pork anymore in Hebrew and Muslim versions, Arabic versions, and so on, when he was eating pork in the Greek and Christian versions, and so on. So the question now is to go after the adaptations of the meeting, to see who are the authors of the contrafacta, of the literary responses to the Roman Alexander, thinking of when meeting the other, when meeting challenging other life skills. Okay. So now coming to our first text. In the handout there's more text and there's more context, just for anybody who wants to read the few lines I can refer to in context. The first two sources, very important sources, give us only a short hint what this meeting was in antiquity. The one source is speaking about on the Secretos, that he was sent by Alexander to meet, to research this sophist. I call it a field trip of a philosopher. And then he comes up and finds them in a situation where they are like yogis in the field, sitting there motionless until the evening. While on the Secretos comes close to one of them, one of the Indians laugh about him. When Carlos saw the cloak, broad head and high boots as a Macedonian soldier from the 4th century, he laughed and said, after saying this and I'm jumping, he ordered him, if he wanted to listen to the wisdom of the Indians, he had to take off his clothes, lie naked on the same stones and share the discussion. And the main question is this an encounter or is this already a conversion? Is this an encounter between two groups, or the one wants to convert the other already to be the same like him? But there is another person in this meeting with, on the Secretos, and this is Dandamis, or Mandanis in this text, and he looks for a true conversion about the similarities and the differences between Indian and Greek worldview. And again, it comes very quickly in the reported text from antiquity that Mandanis replied that they seem to have sensible ideas, the Greek philosophers, in other respects, but to be wrong in one, in placing nomos, law, above physis, nature, and for they would no be ashamed to get naked as he did and to live simply. And here we see that the texts from late antiquity, or from antiquity, already meet mutual interest, but different taxonomies of behavior. The second source is very important because we have here already the ideas of sending letters, giving letters from the Indians, from Alexander to the Indians, and vice versa. And here we see that the Indians are simply saying, Alexander, you are not a son of a god. We don't need any presents, and we have no fear of that. You can't kill us only once, and we will go on. Okay. These are the original sources from historians of antiquity. But then we have something, a very interesting text, the Berlin Papyrus, which that gives us the idea of school system, of schooling in Hellenistic world. You have. Yes, okay. We have here the system of somebody rewriting scenes at school about a possible meeting of Trump and Kim Il-jung. So we have to write what has to be said there. This is your homework for tomorrow. Yes? And so students are writing this material, and papyri bring us this material. This text is written as a neck riddle. If someone answers right, he goes away alive. If someone answers wrong, he has to be killed. And then let's have a look about these questions. We see especially that these texts are translated to the situation of the Hellenistic culture. The first question is the world, then he asked Alexander the next, the earth or the sea has to feed more animals. He replied, the earth is greater because the sea is upon the earth. And now you can think how you think about world. If the world is floating on water, if water is on earth. This might be still mutual interest in philosophical questions. But then comes the fifth person. He ordered the fifth to say what's generated first, day or night. He replied, the day first by a single night. You get it? Simple answer. The Indian noticed that Alexander was trying to work this out and said so that answers of riddling questions were likely to be just as riddling. And the idea is, who are you, Alexander? If you are Macedonian, the day begins in the morning. If you are Greek, the day begins in the evening. So say how do you are, and then we know what was before. If you begin with the Greek day in the evening, or if you begin with the Macedonian day. If you know who you are, you have the answer. But this is, who do you are? Notice the auton, this is a very complex question. Okay, and then he ordered the last to say, how long is good for a man to live? He replied, as long as he does not regard to death as better than life. And this is exactly the story of Ajax in Sophocles, and how did the Indians knew Sophocles so well that they could reply, oh no, this is no text about Alexander meeting Indians, this is someone imagining in Greek culture the meeting and putting the material on stage. Okay. If we go now on to Philon, we see very well that Philon is using the material of the same situation, but using it as an example that fasting or living naked or being not married, it's giving you the liberty, and it's an example of complete liberty. If we come to Arianos, for example, we see here that Arianos takes the same situation and puts it in clinical context, and puts it in the context that of Diogenes. Yes, the Indians are like the Diogenes. All they do is laying in the sun. But again, this is a Roman problem. This is not a problem of the Indians. If we go now on for, I just want to come to Christian uses. Clemens of Alexandria using the same story and bringing up these sources and saying, okay, living holy does not mean that you are holy if you don't have the true faith. And so this is a pagan example, and it's not a prefiguration. It's only this kind of way. You need it for the right way of Christian life. But after the Clemens of Alexandria, and I'm jumping to the Hebrew version just to finish up with, we have in the Hebrew version also the question translated from the Greek version and turning to another. Who are the more numerous, the dead or the living? They replied, the dead are more numerous, but not to count those who are not longer existent. This is playing on to be or not to be in the language. But how the Hebrew translator translates. Vayish'al echad vayomer lo, and he, in turning to the other, turning to the other, he said, and he asked the other one and said to him, who are more, the living or the dead? And the Indian answered, the dead are more, because the poor and the dead are more than the rich and the living. How this comes into the Hebrew text? This kind of culture criticism about the Greek word. Okay. The last text, The last text I wanted to refer to was Palladius. And he is taking the Greek way of life as archetype, as prefiguration of his way of monastic ascetic life. In this way, he puts the whole story now into, he is a threshold for all these stories of Alexander into Christian culture. Okay. All what I try to show on in this paper is that the many facets of the tradition of the Alexander Roman gives us the possibility to read it as cultural history. Every step, every version, every translation gives us the chance to see what people did with the story, with the novella of the Alexander Roman, and thus became the Alexander Roman tradition became something like a passport of late antiquity, of antiquity coming into the Middle Ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter Lehnardt. And the next lecturer here is Raphael Magarik, who is a PhD candidate in English literature at the University of California, Berkeley, with designated emphasis in Renaissance and early modern studies and Jewish studies. His dissertation, untitled Who Narrates the Bible?, explores how Protestant Bible commentators imagined Moses as a mediating presence in the Pentateuch, transforming the genre of biblical epic. He has published in Milton Studies and Notes and Queries, and he has an article forthcoming in the Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies. And the lecture entitled Conversions Between and Within Religions, a Case from Elizabethan England. Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the center. This is an absolutely wonderful conference, and I feel very lucky to be here. And second of all, I just want to say this is the beginning of a new project that I'm working on. So it's in very, very rough form, and I'm curious what you think, and I'll appreciate any objections, questions for further thought, and the like. We typically think of conversion as happening between religions, right? An association that is registered in the very name of the Center for the Study of Conversions and Inter-Religious Encounters. And that inter has proved highly suggestive, and it accounts for a great deal of the scholarly interest in conversion. Because converts are in some sense both religions, they raise questions about the sharp distinction between the two. Because their practice and ideas, by definition, have changed radically, they destabilize religious claims to stability and reliability. And because their spiritual transformations are so frequently messy and protracted, they live religiously in between. And perhaps they even subvert religious normativity and uniformity. And yet, in early modern England, conversions were not specifically inter-religious encounters, and that's what I want to talk about today. The word conversion certainly could mean that, as when George Abbott asked in his 1600 commentary to Jonah, whether the heathen sailors fearing God indicated, quote, a true conversion from gentilism to the Lord or not. But conversion could also designate the intra-religious Christian movement from sinfulness to redemption. The law of the Lord is perfect, reads the 1611 King James translation of Psalms 1970, converting the soul, and this actually comes from the Vulgate, where it's convertens animas. Pay attention to the verses parallel, second half. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The simple, not the heathen, not the Gentile, not the papist or the Jew. Here, conversion doesn't require another religion. It's something that happens within the religion. Now, early modern usage needn't define our scholarship, and we could distinguish between the two senses of conversion. So Michael Questier, for instance, in his History of Conversion in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, calls Abbott's kind of conversion ecclesiastical, that's between religious groups, and the King James Version Psalm 19 kind, evangelical, right, that's within. And correspondingly, you might say that this conference is interested primarily in ecclesiastical interreligious conversions. The other early modern sense of conversion would then be philologically curious, but conceptually irrelevant to our purposes. And that is actually the way that recent excellent scholarship on conversion in early modern English literature has gone. So Molly Murray wrote a great book about religious lyric and the confessional movement between varieties of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Jeffrey Schulzen's study of how early modern English writers used Jews to imagine their own religious anxieties and uncertainties. And Daniel Wittges's work on the threat of conversion to Islam. To varying degrees, these scholars all admit, as Schulzen writes, that, quote, evangelical and ecclesiastical conversions share particular characteristics, and yet each then sidelines the evangelical background to talk about their preferred form of ecclesiastical conversion between religions or confessions. So you could do that. But you would make a basic mistake about the history of religion. In particular, you would be assuming that early modern English people had things called religions, which had insides and outsides, and were generally taken to be mutually exclusive, such that they could distinguish between intra and inter-religious change, and I'm suggesting they couldn't. In Elizabethan and Jacobean England, I argue, the distinctions did not work like that. The inter-religious was always intra-religious, and vice versa. Paying close attention to early modern English ideas about conversion usefully provincializes our ideas of the interreligious and indeed of religion itself. My argument has three moves. First, I want to give a very brief example of the inseparability of the inter- and intra-religious concepts of conversion, particularly in their Protestant forms. When early modern English Protestants talked about being saved from another religion or from human sinfulness, right, there's that inter and the intra, they were talking about the same thing. Indeed, another religion just was human sinfulness, and human sinfulness was, in some sense, another religion. Right? Nobody's born Protestant. Second, I turn to the conversion story narrated in Book 1 of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which in the kind of developed version of the project I hope will exist, will be a much longer substantive reading. This story, I will argue, requires that we not divide ecclesiastical from evangelical conversion. But Spenser also shows us how the Elizabethan conversion concept organizes the spaces inside and outside religion very differently than we do. Third, and finally, I provide a little theoretical context. Trenchant critiques of a trans-historical concept of religion lead me to think that Spenser does not have a quirky concept of religion, he has an alternative to our concept of religion entirely. To separate a priori the encounters and movements between religions as an object of analysis risks not only imposing our own conceptions on the past, but also hypostasizing the existence of religions as stable, relatively static monads that can be sharply individuated and differentiated. Okay, section 1. In the 16th and 17th centuries, English divines largely did not distinguish between intra and inter-religious conversion. Calling, which is what the Protestant divine William Ames writes in his 1623 Medulla Theologica, quote, is termed conversion. Wait, I'm actually not going to see that. Is termed conversion, Acts 26:20. All who obey the call of God are completely turned from sin to grace and from the world to follow in Christ. The quotation appears in the sequence of chapters detailing the process of individual salvation: predestination, calling, justification, adoption, sanctification, and glorification. We should all be so lucky. It's worth noting the obvious, that for Ames, and he was in this respect utterly typical, everyone needs conversion to be saved. In the cited verse in Acts, Paul explains to Agrippa that, quote, he shewed him first unto them of Damascus and at Jerusalem and throughout all the coasts of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God and do works meet for repentance. And in some versions, English versions of the time, that's repentance, and in some it's conversion. It's the same word. Without hesitation, Ames is using a verse about conversion between communities as the paradigm for universal conversion from sin to grace. Also note that neither the King James Version nor the Geneva Bible uses the word conversion here. They use repentance. But Ames understands these two words as close to synonymous. If he differentiates them, it's phenomenologically as stages within a single process. Conversion is the initial, essentially passive moment of being called. Repentance then follows. Writers on conversion thus pivot easily between the general phenomenon of conversion and the specific redemption from an alien religion. In a 1576 sermon, For instance, the preacher Anthony Anderson expounds on Psalm 23, which he, following the Book of Common Prayer, translates, quote, "He shall convert my soul," in Hebrew that's nafshi yeshovev, "and lead me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The usage of convert at all here is interesting, since the King James Version in Geneva have restoreth, and the latter glosses comforteth or refresheth me. But that's just conversion in England, in early modern England. Given these alternative translations and the context of the psalm itself, the liturgical translation clearly takes conversion to include the reinforcing of existing belief, and not just radical transformation. Indeed, Anderson explains, "We are by nature stubborn," and that's true enough, "and after regeneration by the Spirit, there remaineth yet in us such matter of massy sin that we remain in need of conversion." And yet Anderson's reading of the verse does not preclude its application to what we would, anachronistically I think, call ecclesiastical conversion, that is, conversion between. He continues, quote, "By the preaching of the word, the world from time to time hath been won to Christ the Son of God, and by the same the Gentiles are converted unto him. Hereby this nation is changed into truth and popery overthrown. By this shall the hearts of the children be turned to the faith of their fathers in God. And this property David giveth to the word. The law of the Lord, saith he, converteth the soul. The testimony of the Lord is faithful, and giveth light unto the eyes." Now, in defending and explaining the practice of preaching, Anderson is implicitly making sense of his own preaching itself. Thus, it's especially striking that he conflates the regeneration of already converted believers on the one hand, and the historical conversion of Gentiles and the current of overthrowing of popery on the other hand. Anderson sees his continued work of preaching, presumably to a Protestant audience in 1576, as aimed at both intra- and inter-religious conversion. Indeed, he sees both as the same thing. Section 2. Indeed, on this conception in its most radical form, a sinful person is an adherent of another religion. Take the Fairy Queen, to which I'll now turn. The first book of Spenser's allegorical romance tells the story of the Red Cross Knight. Because the poem is allegorical, it's got a double plot. In the explicit plot, the Red Cross Knight is induced by the sorcerer Archimago to desert his lady, Una, in favor of the temptress Duessa, who enslaves him to the giant Orgoglio. Allegorically, the Red Cross Knight has been tricked by a mendicant priest and has deserted the pure Protestant church in favor of papist idolatry, which in turn then enslaves him to pride, and so on. Eventually, the Red Cross Knight is saved by King Arthur, that is Christ. He is regenerated in the House of Holiness, and he finally kills the dragon, terrorizing Una's parents, and is engaged to her. It would make a very good movie. The Red Cross Knight might be said to convert on both levels of the text. In the text's plain meaning, his time in the House of Holiness is meant to cure his vices, particularly lust, so that he can be appropriately engaged to Una. Allegorically, having been under the grips of the papist Archimago, the Red Cross Knight is also switching confessions. Strikingly, though, the Red Cross Knight is imagined as papist even before his encounters from Archimago, Duessa, or any other ecclesiastical deviant. Take his name itself, which derives from the heraldic icon adorning his shield and breastplate. St. George's Cross, that's the Red Cross. The Red Cross in question is described in the poem's second stanza, which I'll read. "But on his breast a bloody cross he bore, the dear remembrance of his dying Lord, for whose sweet sake that glorious badge he wore, and dead as living ever him adored. Upon his shield the like was also scored, for sovereign hope which in his help he had. Right faithful true he was in deed and word, but of his cheer did seem too solemn sad. Yet nothing did he dread, but ever was he dread." Now, this all seems very pious, fulfilling as it does 2 Corinthians 4:10, which enjoins Christians to bear, quote, "about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our body." But the knight isn't carrying the dying of the Lord Jesus in his body, but rather on his armor, right? Further, the Red Cross Knight does not really bear Jesus' burden, since his cross is just a painted sign, which is practically weightless. What should have been internal and metaphorical has been mistakenly externalized and literalized, and the literal burden has been made a sign. The proliferation of images underscores the problem. The punishment for one mistaken icon is a second. In Elizabethan England, of course, the Red Cross Knight's problematic relationship to images, right, he's got too many of them, would be immediately legible as papists. The constant refrain of Protestant reformers in the period, as they smashed the stained glass of church windows and stripped altarpieces of their ornamentation, was that papism idolatrously confused internal states for external representations. And indeed, that seems to be exactly our hero's condition when he is initially introduced a stanza later. Right? A gentle knight was pricking on the plain, he clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dints of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Yet, arms till that time did he never wield, his angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield. Full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one for knightly justs and fierce encounters fit. Again, the glorious outside misleads us. By his dented, battle-marked armor, the warrior seems a full jolly knight, fit for knightly justs and fierce encounters. And yet, as it turns out, he's untested and unwounded. The Red Cross Knight, then, is pricking on the plain. That is, he operates entirely on the realm of plain sense appearances, which lack the appropriate inner significances. He's a walking crisis of representation. But note that it could be hardly be otherwise. What period polemic and Spencer understood as the cardinal papist sin of idolatrous misrepresentation emerges naturally here from the unexperienced, unconverted knight's dedication of himself to a noble external task. Right? You just start out doing the right thing and it turns out you're a papist. In the argument's full version, I rehearsed the specific links that tie the Red Cross Knight's initial representational troubles to first the avowedly papist characters he encounters later in the book, and second the Protestant iconoclastic discourses of the period. And as the project develops, I'm interested in asking some broader questions about Spencerian allegory and conversion. What exactly is the relationship between inward virtue and ecclesiastical affiliation in the Fairy Queen? Does allegory allow us to see, for instance, papism as, quote, really present as a basically Protestant category? What ontologies of religion might make a representational schema focused on insides and outsides most attractive? That is, as a literary critic, I'm hoping a revised understanding of how ecclesiastical and evangelical conversion work will open some specifically representational questions about the conversion narratives of the first book of the Fairy Queen. But right now I want to suggest just that the Red Cross Knight is in important ways papist before he's ever encountered Archimago or Duessa. Indeed, these stanzas imagine papist icons to be produced almost automatically and without malice or intent from the fallen attempt to live a good Christian life. And as the poem continues, conversion requires that papism be intensified until it can be recognized clearly. What it means to start out as an unconverted Christian in the Fairy Queen is to be a papist. Section 3. What follows from understanding evangelical and ecclesiastical conversion as mutually constitutive and basically inseparable? For Spencer, part of what follows is that to become a good Protestant, you have to start as a papist. What we would think of as the Red Cross Knight's ecclesiastical movement can also be described as the developmental life cycle of a Protestant Christian. In the following closing section, I want to put that in some theoretical context. At least since Talal Assad's 1993 Genealogies of Religion, there has emerged a movement within religious studies broadly critical of the transhistorical use of the category religion. The argument, as Assad, Saba Mahmoud, Timothy Fitzgerald, Tomoko Matsusawa, Daniel Boyarin, and a number of others have put it, is that religion in its contemporary sense is a category that emerges from Protestantism, secularism, and the modern nation state. Right? And you could have an argument about exactly when. On this view, the attempt to demarcate a particular religious field in various cultures around the world and throughout the pre-modern past requires the colonial reshaping of those cultures and misprison of their indigenous categories. If this is true, historians of religion should see their task less as the essentialist attempt to understand how religion manifests in various times and places, and more as the self-reflexive attempt to understand how the concept religion has shifted in meaning over time, how it came to be applied so broadly and through whose efforts, and what alternative ways of conceptually organizing shared practices and beliefs might be. So it's beyond the scope of this paper, obviously, to argue for this stance, though I do find it broadly attractive. Rather, assuming Assad et al. Are broadly correct, I want to make 2 points. First, we have a hard time theorizing the early modern interpenetration of evangelical and ecclesiastical conversion because we are importing our conception of religion onto early modern English people. In particular, I think, modern religions are supposed to have clear boundaries with respect to personal identity. If you are a Protestant, you are not a Catholic, and vice versa, right? And if you're both, it's an exception. If you are a Jew, you are neither of the former. Relatedly, we tend to assume that religious identity is at least normatively stable over an individual's lifetime, such that it gets interesting when you ask questions about the switchers. Right? Of course, Catholics do become Protestants and all that, but that's a switch between religions. The convert comes from outside the religious system into it. For Spencer, by contrast, Protestantism succeeds, but also presupposes papism. And understanding and coming to grips with your own papism is crucial to being a good Protestant. Spencer's church thus contains its religious other within itself as a necessary component in its self-conceptualization. Second, the discursive self-reflexive turn in religious studies has a corollary for the study of conversion. Instead of asking a series of questions about conversions, I would suggest we need to start by asking questions about the discursive history of the term conversion. First comes a philological project, which starts not with our categories, but with their words. How do the meanings of the words convert and conversion change over time? Second, a history of scholarship. At what point and how do converts become an identifiable, distinguished subset of all religious people and an object of study in their own right? Relatedly, how did we come to study the space in between religions? And what assumptions about religions were made in order to render that space legible and coherent? Third, and finally, a broader historical lens. What modern institutions, reaching beyond the university to, for instance, the nation state and market capitalism, help structure the interreligious in the process of moving between religions? Pursuing this program would mean giving up the ability to compare conversions cross-culturally, at least in a straightforward sense. But in return, we might get some forms of religious hybridity and convolution that our current categories occlude entirely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raphael Magarik. And our respondent today is Alexander van der Haven, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters here in Ben-Gurion University. And he is also a lecturer at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya and a professor at Webster University, St. Louis. He researches early modern conversions to Judaism in the Dutch Republic, as well as the emergence of alternative forms of religion in the 19th century. He has published, among others, a number of articles about conversion to Judaism in the Dutch Republic, most recently in Renaissance Quarterly. Moreover, this year will appear with Idra Press, a revised Hebrew edition of his book about Sarah the Ashkenazi, wife of Sabbatai Tzvi, originally published in English in 2012, and her role in the Sabbatean movement. Please.
This is one of the panels where actually the title of the panels and the papers really match well, which is not a tradition in conferences. So the panel is about imagining conversion. So it's about stories about conversion, about converts, and both of the speakers raise historical questions about it. So it's not nice stories about conversion, let's have a literary approach, but how do we deal with these kind of traditions as historians? The first story we've seen is about a standoff between the great conqueror Alexander the Great and a bunch of naked gurus somewhere in India, and then later it also becomes Africa. And the second is based around the first book of Spencer's, The Fairy Creed. So what I wanted to do is run towards a more general question that both of the speakers can engage with. And I will first try to kind of summarize your papers, so you can say you misunderstood it, or this basically raises some questions. I think throughout my summary I also ask you a few other questions that will fit with the more general comments I have to make. So what I understood from Peter's presentation is that the uses of the Alexander story and the very differences between them shows that the interest of the users is basically geared towards how we want to use them at home, rather than what do we know about Alexander, what do we know about Hindu philosophy. An example, for instance, is Palladius, which seems to be the longest text in the tradition. Yeah, so you mention there like a violent conqueror meeting a bunch of monks, Christian monks in the desert, who sell themselves as, we are actually ascetics and you are a greedy conqueror. We are peaceful, the only person we really harm is the evil one, Satan, where you are committing bloodshed. So you can see that basically it's an exotic story. The ingredients are exotic, but actually the story is about us. Another example is the Talmud. I think one of the first postmodernist works in history, in which basically takes the story of the standoff, in this case the questions given to the sadhus, with as a result, will I cut off your head or not? And it seems that the Talmudic writers in this instance, they're not really interested in Alexander. It's just another really nice story. Then they go all kinds of different directions. It's on the way to Africa. So it seems to have very little to do with Alexander himself or with Hinduism. Similarly, Rafi's analysis. So he basically, in his paper, he uses Spencer's first book to think about conversion in terms of ecclesiastical conversions, or conversion between religions, and I'm adding brackets on each side of the word religion, so you won't get angry at me. And evangelical conversion, so the notion of a transformative process within a certain religion that can also be called like repentance, or in specific traditions being born again. And so what Rafi is arguing is, if you read this text really well, there's no real distinction between the two. Yeah, and for him this is a criticism, and he uses our good friend Talal Assad. I've been angry with Assad for many years, so this is good for a discussion. So what Rafi basically is saying, this is an example of how our modern Protestant approaches of what it is religion are detrimental for trying to understand the way we think about, in this case, the term conversion many years ago, in this case in Elizabethan England. And I'm using a quote from you to make more clear what the specific sin of the modern approach is modern religions, according to Assad, this is the wrong presupposition, modern religions are supposed to have clear boundaries with respect to personal identity. Yeah, and so the story of tonight shows basically that this is not the case, because there's no clear evidence between, clear difference between the ecclesiastical conversion and the evangelical conversion. I have a bit of an issue with this, because first of all, and Assad betrays himself here, like he argues that the modern notion of religion is a Protestant notion of religion, and what characterizes modern Protestant notion of religion is the dismissal of this difference. Yeah, so if a Protestant modern evangelical, for instance, like you have to convert even though you were born as an evangelical. And it's basically, this whole notion has become part of modern Protestant discourse. So I'm almost feeling that Assad is more essentializing religion than modern Protestants are doing. It reminds me of a presentation we had last year of a scholar who argued that the birth of Islam was actually the birth of a distinct text community, and a text community. So this wasn't a religion, but this was a kind of a text community. And I was feeling that you are making here the distinction between religion and something else, in this case texts, and Muhammad and his friends, cousin Ali and his father-in-law Abu Bakr, they were like, what are you talking about? Yes, we're that community and we're dealing with God and stuff. So I feel this is a little bit the same case. And what I would suggest, actually, what I would really like, is you can also use this to criticize Assad. Yeah, it's almost like this is an ivory tower community talking about religion, whereas on the religious field, religious people themselves do not distinguish that greatly between intra-religious conversion and inner-religious conversion. But that would be, I think, would be a really interesting way to take a look. So also not only, like say, we should reconsider the use of religion in the past, but also we should reconsider what Talal Assad is saying. Yeah? Because I think this might be a good direction. Okay, so moving to the general issue, and I was actually very happy to have to respond to this paper. Sometimes you end up responding to something, what's my relationship? And I'm just trying to finish up an article about narratives written by Jewish proselytes and that the Jewish afterlives of these texts, and it raises very similar issues. So the big issue that I'm opening for you and that you might want to respond to is, so these texts are either written as fiction, yeah, so in the case of Spencer's first book, and the rest of his book, yeah, so they're written as fiction, or at some point they become fiction, like fiction. For instance, like my Jewish proselytes, at some point they become mythical proselytes. Like you see later, usually like they don't care anymore that there was a real person, and they fuse with other people. So to the point that they're not relevant anymore. So to which extent? So how do you approach these texts? Are you going to ask to which extent these represent, or how do they relate to historical reality? Yeah, so that's one of the questions you're using. Or to which extent should we study these texts as literary texts in which they have their own specific dynamics? And these are often in conflict with each other. And I'll end with raising this question for your specific project. So for instance, in Rafi's analysis, so Spencer represents the knight who, on the surface of the story, falls into sin and repents and comes back. So this would be, in the terminology, like an evangelical conversion. But Spencer represents the knight as a Catholic in all kinds of ways. So even from his attire to the way he speaks, to what he does. And I'm thinking, if you're a good writer, and you know, Spencer wasn't so bad, this would be part of a writing technique. So you mirror somebody's appearance, somebody's behavior to an inner transformation. So like so this can be a literary use of ecclesiastical conversion to describe evangelical conversion. So this doesn't. So to which extent does this reflect historical reality? And then of course you can say, oh, well, let's then move to the audience. Yeah, so he's using an association that the audience is very familiar with, because for them they are the same. But a good writer also screws with his audience or her audience. So you make weird switches and you do different things. So this is a bit of a challenge when you deal with literary text. The same thing is with the Alexander story. If and I got a bit this out of your argument. If you say, well, it's so clear that all these users completely disregard Alexander and the Hindus. He was like, it might not even have happened. They don't care. They just use the story. So then actually the question is raised. So why would you study the Alexander tradition? Why not just say, what is the function of this story in this specific context? And no matter where it's taken from, the shopping list of your wife or the story about the famous conqueror, it doesn't matter. And it reminds me a little bit of, because I also thought of maybe solutions. What I really liked in my research is looking at different versions. Why did specific people change certain aspects? You can, these things say. But then also stories, if you, like for instance, the work of Levi-Strauss, you almost like the users are not that important. The stories themselves develop. They develop alternatives. They make changes. Yeah. So this is also a question. So what is the relationship between story and historical reality? Is it the inner dynamics of the story, or is it like throw it at the side and is it the story itself? Okay. Now I moved. I passed the problem to all of you. Okay.
So I begin first of all with this, that everyone who wrote about Alexander was writing history. This was the history. This was a secular book. And this is the interesting point of view, that the religious part that I chose, that the word, the philosophical encounter, is only a very short period in this book. It's only one chapter out of almost 240. So this is the first idea, that the text is a window for philosophical reflection. Who is Alexander? Who is this worldview of Alexander that makes it possible to conquer the world? So this is an argument any author and any audience with the book of Alexander has to deal with. Who is this kind of lifestyle, living like Alexander? And so this meeting the strangers has then a literary dynamic to get all these versions. So the first thing is, yes, any author of this, any reviser, any rewriter, translator of this book is writing history for his time and his place. This is a history book, even if it's very much had nothing to do with modern critical historical approach. And the other thing I think is clear from this text, that everybody brings his literary community to it, and is writing Gemara on the meeting in the Talmud, writing a tractate on asceticism in Christianity. Everybody tries to put these stories in his own taxonomy, but again, it's in secular literature. And we have to be the blood-brain barrier between antiquity and medieval times, when most of the texts that came over were and rewritten and recomposed were religious texts. This text has a very special character, that he came over and was adapted in all new religious communities around the Mediterranean. So again, this is the special function of the text, and this makes it so interesting that the only interreligious encounter in this text becomes an intra-religion discussion in any culture of the transmission.
Okay, so I'll take the second question first, because it's the easier one. So the Fairy Queen is obviously a literary idealization, and you might ask to what extent this actually reflects a kind of lived cultural reality. And I give you two answers. As an amateur cultural historian, because I'm not one, I would say that I do think you find this same phenomenon in what we could call naive conversion narratives. That is to say, the second half of the 16th century is full of people who were all but illiterate telling their personal conversion stories. And I do think they go back into their past and they say, oh, I was a Catholic. You know, and so I don't think it's just restricted to the Fairy Queen. I think it is in the culture, but the truth is I'm not so interested in that. The piece I'm interested in as a literary scholar is the question of basically how does conversion get represented, and in particular the scholarship as it exists tends to imagine, because it imagines conversion primarily as ecclesiastical, it imagines conversion as a fundamentally disruptive force to the religious system. And that's those three books that I kind of talked about, the Wittges, the Schulzen, and the Murray. That is to say that the presence of conversion in texts is always something that unsettles stability over time. And so even though I think the cultural historical argument is true, it's not what I'm after. What I'm after is an account of actually how conversion provides a kind of organizing frame for a text like the Fairy Queen that stabilizes the religious system, right? Conversion as a principle of stability rather than conversion as a principle of disruption. So, you know, there's a way in which this paper is kind of accommodated to the questions of cultural history that surround conversion, but that's not sort of what's really in it for me. And, you know, and it's interesting I didn't really make that explicit in the paper, which is a shame. On Assad, so first of all, I would just say that I think Assad is wrong about almost everything, except for the important point. right? So he's wrong about 16th century and 17th century Protestantism. He's wrong about late antique religion. He's wrong about, you know, most of the historical narrative he's telling. But I do think he's right that the concept that we have and the concept that they have in any given period are not the same, and that there's that danger of intense anachronism, right? And so in that sense, I think it's important that actually the argument, the piece that I'm interested in him is not so much the Protestantism, because as I said, the point about conversion being running together, intra and inter, you know, runs back, it's not just in the King James, it's also in the Vulgate, right? It's in the Latin, it's an old point. So in a certain sense, the Assad is being used as a kind of corrosive skepticism rather than a particular account to which I assent. But the piece I would insist on that really is weird in this stuff, that I do think should sound foreign to us, because I think it is foreign, is the sense that religions, whatever, you know, and one of the kind of questions that I have to answer as I'm doing this work is what's the term that I want to use from the early modern texts? You know, and I'm sad to say I don't have a great answer, which is why we end up putting quotation marks around religion for the moment. But that religions are not things that exist in parallel, they are hierarchically stacked within each other, right? If you tried to do a Pew survey of, you know, Elizabethan England, you just couldn't ask someone, are you a Protestant, are you a papist, right? Are you, I mean, you know, are you a Jew? Obviously they wouldn't want to answer that particular last question there. But right, you couldn't ask them that, and that's the first point. And the second point, which is more interesting, is that it would be incoherent to talk about switchers, to talk about people who move between the different components, because switching was essential to the dominant Elizabethan Protestant church, right? And that point, that religions don't exist as parallel possibilities, such that moving between them is moving between one and another, right? But rather exist as hierarchically stacked sort of organisms within each given item, right? So that Protestantism kind of cuts up the world differently than Catholicism does. I think that point genuinely is different from the way we think about it today. And I know there's a looseness about we, because there's obviously different we's at stake there, but I think there's something a little weird about that. Yeah. You know, and it's a similar weirdness, you know, I think you can go back into the medieval period. It's the same, it's a related weirdness to the weirdness in Dante's Inferno, where, you know, Muhammad shows up in the section of hell reserved for schismatics, right? The imagination of Islam as a kind of subgenre of Christianity. So I hope that's sort of satisfying to you. In a sense, I'm not sort of worried about whether Assad's right or wrong about the particulars of his point. I'm just kind of using it as a kind of engine to motivate, you know, a version of studying conversion that is not about comparing cross-culturally instances of the same thing, but noticing how the thing is fundamentally different in different places and times.
Alexander, would you like to remark, or I can open? I would like to open the table. It's fine. Okay. All right. So I'm opening the panel for discussion, for questions and remarks. Dov, would you like to start, please?
Yes.
Please take the mic.
My blood is boiling, then I am not sure that I am able to to take the micro properly. But anyway, concerning Peter, after listening to you, I don't think that we are dealing here with conversion at all. We are here rather dealing with the topos of the alien wisdom developed by Greeks and afterwards elaborated by others, and even Christian, Muslims and Jews. They continued with this idea that there are some pagans who are neither they are not from the Abrahamic religions, and there are some wisdom, and this wisdom has not a function, a conversionary function, but I will say a challenging function vis-a-vis our certainties. We are heard here last year. I know it wasn't here, but anyway, it was by a great scholar on these issues, Jean-Paul Rouviers, who he shows very well how this topos of the Indian wise philosopher, it's precisely that. It's a topos that enables to engage into a conversation without conversion. It's a way of considering human beings without the or, but with a possibility of having a third one, a triangular relationship. This is my basic comment to Peter, and now to Raphael. The problem is not Assad, of course, and not Boyarin. The problem are with postmodernist and post-colonial thinking, because most of the scholars, and I have a lot of admiration, they finally, they doesn't enable us to think in universal terms. There is any more common language, because they depart from the assumption, I think that Alexander was right, that any culture is essential, it's closed. The problem of using conversion or not is beyond the problem of conversion. It's a problem of human communication and the possibility to have a conversation between humankind instead of always using force, power, and resistance. It's more than that. And precisely with the historians, we can do this on the one hand, being aware of problems of anachronism, and we do that by contextualizing that as you did, yeah. And sometimes we can say, okay, let's continue to use the name, because not only is we accepted it as part of our linguistic tradition, but it is still useful. But as historians, let's check the possibility or the applicability or the I will say the variations of using the term according to the different context. Otherwise, we cannot have any transcultural conversation. And this is the real, I am very worried about this very issue. And just concerning the conversio, also in Catholic lands, let's say the Jesuits, the idea of conversion is mainly not to join from one religion to another, but it's a kind of personal transformation. In this sense, we are rather a common ground, even if you are right. The Protestant environment is very different, and this led me to my last point, is that perhaps Spencer is doing here what Thomas Hobbes did with his notion of the natural state of humankind. Because in Hobbes, the natural state, the idea that every person is fighting another restlessly, is not a reality. It's a theoretical reality which enables him to think about society and politics. In other ways, both in Hobbes and perhaps in Spencer, here we are dealing with what we can call with Barthes the 0 degree of conversion. And that is why you have to begin by being a Catholic in order to better understand what conversion means. And this, of course, joins your point in this sense. Thank you. Sorry.
Please bring back to the mic.
My answer would be like that this scene has a context in the Alexander story. So it is the turning point. This is the end of the conqueror. This is and so the texts are putting the encounter into a context of life-changing event and culture-changing event. These are the borders of Hellenistic expansion. And so there is a broader context, a dramatic context of the mind game of the wise other. This is the special
the special element. There are more texts from antiquity speaking about the foreign sage, the alien sage with his wisdom and so on. But here in this context, it's the meeting that Alexander is intent to kill them if they don't give the right answers and so on. So I see this far more, I see this closer to an event of conquering another, bringing another person, you're meeting from one status to another. Yes, and so this is my question. And to your second argument, question to him, yes, there are families. They are not only individuals. There are clans. There are nations. So if you don't have any culture, any nation, any languages anymore, so you can speak about in postmodern terms that you only have this. But again, I'm dealing with a lot of languages, a lot of cultures, persons in families and so on. So.
Yeah, let's see. I think on the last point, I think the BART is very suggestive and interesting, and it's a really wonderful theoretical recommendation. On the very first point, I don't see either Assad or post-colonial theory in general as doing that. It seems to me you're perfectly right that it's a question of communication. It's just whose words are we going to use, our words or their words, right? And in my mind, the goal of the communication ought to be at getting better at using their words in a way that they would have recognized, rather than imposing our words on them and then sort of squeezing when things don't fit. So I think I'm making a much less radical point. It's kind of not a philosophical point about the possibility of communication with the past. It's a political point about on whose terms, you know, and in particular on the terms of the researcher or on the terms of the subject material. I'm sorry if I missed some of the stuff in between, but, you know, and yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, no.
Okay, it was actually meant as a comment to Raphael. Good morning. It was meant as a comment to Raphael, and but now it's like I think I'm harmonizing everybody with this because of this communication thing. I had just finished a postdoc on the literary topic of the Jewish daughter and the father, and we showed, and as Rachel and me showed yesterday, how historical events go together with literature. Literature picks up what is there and, I don't know, makes a stereotype out of it or whatever you want to call it, a motive, but it is there to negotiate something. And in case of this Jewish daughter and you all know this motive, you have the old ugly Jewish father, and then you have the beautiful Jewish daughter that at some point converts. Now, and you have that in Christian literature. I was like the Merchant of Venice, for example, and I was looking at the German literature, well, German, whatever you call German-speaking literature in the early modern period, and you can see what you were also saying. The Jewish daughter already converted before she was actually Christian before she converted. She converted at the end, but as you said, she was already, and then everything was put in. What also the other big question at the time, one was the emancipation of the Jews that very much unsettled the political arena in Germany, and the second was emancipation of women. And in this motive, they packed everything together. The daughter converts, but the daughter was everything that is expected of a bourgeois woman at the time. So she was very domestic, and you know all these cliches that you have from this time in the literature. So she was already Christian. Then she converted, but the whole thing was also to unsettle Judaism. It was written by Protestants in my case, and it was in order to negotiate the emancipation of Jews at the time, and what kind of Jews do we want in our state, and that was projected onto the women, and the ugly father was, you know, everything that you do with castrated, actually. You know, everything was also, you also even have that in Lessing's Nathan the Wise, in a way, because he also ends up without a daughter. You know, everything is being taken away from the Jews. So it is a way of negotiating, and so here we come back to history. It is fiction, but it is also history, and it is a way of negotiating, and I think I harmonized everything now. Okay.
I give one more question.
Thank you very much. I would like to return to the Alexander the Great and his romance. I wouldn't agree with your point that the meeting of Alexander with Brahman, with the snake twice people, is the very end of his journey. Because later on he continues and he meets other different people. His journey is a journey on the margins. And every meeting is, if not conversion, then a conquest.
In the Roman or in the...
In the Roman. In the Roman as well.
There are different options.
Of course, different versions. My question is there any version of Roman you are aware of which doesn't have this meeting with Brahmans? Thank you.
There are many not complete versions, so I think some probably the Coptic version or something like this, but I'm not aware of all. But I just want to bring up another story. Alexander hears about the alien wisdom and goes out in the forest, in the European version, to meet the Dundamis, the wise person, but he's unable to see him. So he has to send on his creatures, because he is a cynical, because he's not materialist, and he's able to find Dundamis. So this is a very nice literary story about how Alexander is unable to see the other option, the other language, the other body language, the other reference to landscape and to personal autarky, to stay autark on your place all the time of your life. So just another example for another meetings and another tournament. But to your argument, the Alexander romance has for every questions at least 3 or 4 answers. 3 or 4 novellae that are, and if it's Kandaki, the women, if it's Amazons that you can't conquer, and so on and so on. It's not a historical source that tries to bring it up to one point. But again, there are so many versions. I have to really check it in which version it's not a slip that it's not there, but somebody took this meeting out of the text. Okay?
Thank you.
Would you like to respond to Noah?
Yeah. It's very interesting, this question of whether the Jewess is Christian all along. In Ivanhoe, right, Rebecca is, right? She's good all along. If you actually look at The Merchant of Venice, it's not like that. Jessica is a Jewess at the beginning, and she then later, after she converts, she kind of talks about the change that has happened in her relationship with her father and this and that. And I would actually suggest that's part of the question of whether you imagine, right? Obviously both these texts are texts that are deeply inimical to Judaism, right? But is the inimical to Judaism version the kind of romantic version on which she's kind of born innocent and Christian? Or is it the early modern version on which, no, she's born Jewish, because everybody's born Jewish, right? Everybody is born fallen, and you have to convert, right? So actually I would challenge this idea that she's always Jewish. In the early modern version, she starts out, or that she's always Christian, she starts out really Jewish, because in that version, conversion is not something that you have to sort of smooth over or get away from by showing an underlying continuity. In that version, conversion is a desirable thing, right? It's built into the fundamental narrative that there's going to be a radical change.
Okay, I'm sorry, we have to stop here. Thank you very much.